I bring with me this morning Exhibit A, shall we call it? Exhibit A of Mara's adolescent insecurities. Guess jeans. Do any of you remember Guess jeans from the 80s and 90s that had the little triangle emblem on the back pocket, a little triangle emblem that said Guess on it? Those were the thing to wear, the thing to have. Those Guess jeans that had a particular kind of cut to them and a particular cost to them as well. And the presence of those jeans on the bodies of the girls around me made me aware that I was less than, or made me think that I was less than, I'll say. And there were two reasons for that. First of all, my parents couldn't afford Guess jeans. And second, even if my parents could have afforded Guess jeans, they didn't make Guess jeans in a cut that would fit my chubby adolescent body. So I wore hand-me-down jeans that never fit quite right. And I was very aware that I would never reach the highest social status in my school in ill-fitting hand-me-down jeans. So I knew, even at 12 years old, according to these cultural messages that I received, that I was less than. And today's sermon is for all of us who wore ill-fitting hand-me-down jeans. It's for all of us less-thans. So when I was 12, I thought there were only two kinds of people: the Guess jeans people, and those were the people who were thin in all the right places and beautiful and perfect and rich and happy, and we hated them. And then there were the ill-fitting hand-me-down jeans kind of people who were lumpy and awkward and sometimes had good personalities. There were only two kinds of people. And thank goodness, since I was 12, I've actually been gifted with deep friendships with some of the people that I thought were Guess jeans people. And I now know, at the age of 42, that behind those labels and behind what I thought was perfect hair had the same insecurities as me. So I'm pretty sure that even if there are some Guess jeans wearers among us, you'll find something in Jesus' teaching today too. And I might even still be able to like you. But I'm going to use Guess jeans today as a symbol for all that we wrongly think is better than. So my adolescence aside, and maybe yours too, can we just agree that it's really messed up that we place value on bodies based on standards that are completely arbitrary? We place value on bodies based on the particular cut of a piece of denim, or we place different values on bodies based on the kinds of images that companies put out when they have products to sell, making us think that we can become better than if we just spend money so that they can increase their bottom line. Can we agree that this is ridiculous? But even though it's ridiculous, I think we can all agree on that, it's also really sneaky. And it's more than just clothing. There's diet culture, there's fat shaming, there's disparities in sports uniforms and sexualization of sport, and dress code disparities between men and women, and the fact that black bodies have to fear police in a way that white bodies don't. All evidence of the ways that some bodies in our culture have more value than others. Some bodies have more value than others based on arbitrary things. Now, this is nothing new to humanity, this devaluing of bodies. We may have perfected it and monetized this devaluation of bodies, but it existed no less in Jesus' time than in ours. So today we're going to hear Jesus talking to a group of people whose lives and bodies had been devalued. These would have been the ill-fitting hand-me-down jeans people that Jesus is speaking to. So you'll need a little bit of the backstory for all of this to come together. This was the time of the Passover, and you may remember that the Passover is a major Jewish holiday when they celebrate the ways that God preserved their lives and helped them escape slavery from Egypt. So in the time of Passover, when it was around that time, all good Jews would travel from wherever they were to Jerusalem to celebrate the Passover. So we'll call this the Guess Jeans crowd. The Guess Jeans people would put on their perfect togas or head coverings or whatever it was that they had. They would pack up and leave town to go to Jerusalem to celebrate the proper religious holiday in the proper way. But Jesus wasn't talking to the Guess Jeans people in this text because they'd all left town. Jesus didn't go to Jerusalem for this Passover. Jesus stayed in Galilee. He stayed with those who were too poor to travel to Jerusalem, or too old, or too sick, or maybe too skeptical about religion in order to do this Jerusalem Passover thing. Jesus stayed with these ill-fitting hand-me-down jeans people, these people whose bodies were considered to be less than, these people who had to work incredibly hard just to scrape by, the people who suffered the most, the people whose bodies suffered the most from the oppressive Roman government, the people who lived on the very edge of survival. That's who Jesus was with for this Passover. So at the point that we'll read in just a second from John chapter 6, Jesus had already had a few days with this ill-fitting hand-me-down jeans crowd who wasn't in Jerusalem for Passover. So they'd sort of been swarming around Jesus as he moved around Galilee. You might remember the story where Jesus feeds the 5,000 with just the 5 loaves and the 2 fishes. That's the same crowd that Jesus is speaking to here. That was maybe a day or two before what we're going to read today. And then that night, Jesus walks on water. So he does miracles in the presence of this crowd. And right after Jesus walks on water, the disciples whisk him away in the boat to try to get him away from the crowd, and it's at night, so they can't see where he went. And in the morning, the crowds are all out there in their boats looking for Jesus. And finally, they find him. They find him because they're intrigued by him. They're intrigued, and they want to know more, but they don't fully understand these things that he's doing and he's talking about. And when they find him, they ask him for a sign. Give us a sign, they said, of who you are and what you're about. And they say, God gave our ancestors the sign of manna. You might remember when they were wandering in the desert, the Israelite people, God fed them with manna, which was food that fell from the sky. They said, God gave our ancestors manna. Give us a sign too. Give us a sign to tell us something about who you are and how we fit with who you are. Now, I can imagine Jesus rolling his eyes. I don't think Jesus probably didn't roll his eyes out loud like I do sometimes, but maybe quietly. Like, I've been giving you signs. I've been giving you signs. But apparently feeding this huge crowd of 5,000 people with just a kid's lunch and walking on water isn't enough. But Jesus isn't in the business of doing miracles on demand in order to prove that he's God. But he is in the business of teaching and of giving himself as a sign. So what Jesus is going to say, if you haven't been raised taking communion in your whole life, what Jesus has to say is super weird. So just prepare yourself for that. And if it doesn't sound weird to you, just remember that it's kind of weird. All right, so we're going to read from John chapter 6. It's in your bulletin if you want to follow along, starting at verse 51. Jesus says, I am the living bread that came down from heaven. Whoever eats of this bread will live forever, and the bread that I will give for the life of the world is my flesh. The Jews then disputed among themselves, saying, how can this man give us his flesh to eat? So Jesus said to them, very truly I tell you, unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, you have no life in you. Those who eat my flesh and drink my blood have eternal life, and I will raise them up on the last day. For my flesh is true food, and my blood is true drink. Those who eat my flesh and drink my blood abide in me, and I in them. Just as the living Father sent me, and I live because of the Father, so whoever eats me will live because of me. This is the bread that came down from heaven, not like that which your ancestors ate and they died. But the one who eats this bread will live forever. He said these things while he was teaching in the synagogue at Capernaum, which is in Galilee. When the many disciples heard it, they said, "This teaching is difficult. Who can accept it?" So Jesus kind of says, you remember that manna, that manna thing that you were just talking about? I'm the manna. I'm the bread from heaven, and I am for you. Don't miss the significance of him saying that to these ill-fitting hand-me-down jeans folks, these people whose bodies were in jeopardy. Jesus says, I honor your body by offering you mine. He says, you thought your ancestors were lucky to have this manna as a sign and a gift from God? You have me. I give you my flesh and my blood so that you can enter the unending presence of God. So I'm going to talk about just a couple of things from this passage. This is a deep and richly theological passage that I could totally nerd out on. So I'm holding myself back here. I'm just going to focus on three different things. First, Jesus is body positive. Second, we are receivers of the body. And third, the invitation to consume Christ and not others. So first, Jesus is body positive. So Christianity has a really strange and damaging tradition of teaching that bodies don't matter, of teaching that it's about our souls getting to heaven and nothing else matters. So there's that on the one hand. And then on the other hand, our culture has this weird obsession with bodies, that nothing is as important as how your body looks or how your body functions, and that you should count and track and measure and sweat and suffer until you get that Guess Jeans body. So either bodies don't matter at all or bodies are everything. And Jesus says bodies matter. He corrects both of those problematic ways of being by feeding our bodies with his own body. Jesus honors our bodies by feeding them with his own body. There's no starvation here. There's no punishing exercise. There's no disembodied salvation. Jesus feeds literal bodies. Jesus deems bodies worthy of being fed by God's own body. Jesus is body positive, and maybe we can be too. Secondly, the words of Jesus remind us that we are receivers of grace. We are receivers. Now, when you hear whoever eats this body, now when you think of eating, it's an active thing, right? Maybe you're, back in the day, you would be hunting or gathering for your food. Now we shop for our food and we choose it and we cook it and we prepare it and then we lift the forks and the spoons to our mouths, but that is not what Jesus is talking about here. The word that is translated eat is actually more like feed on. This draws on the imagery of a farmer holding out his or her hand filled with food for the sheep to eat. This is food that is provided, food that is brought with a loving body. That's how Jesus offers his body to us. We don't hunt for this grace. We don't gather it or buy it or even prepare it. We simply receive it as a free gift from God's hand, which is really good news for those of us who are tired, for those of us who aren't quite fully ready to re-enter the world in the midst of COVID, for those of us who have forgotten how to function socially, we don't have to work so hard for God's grace. Simply receive what God provides. It also strikes me that this is good news for those of us who distrust what's being mass-produced by what some call the Christian machine for us to consume. Christianity is a really tricky thing these days with getting wrapped up in politics. But God offers us God's body directly, not formulated or mass-produced by any other being, but directly from God's hand we can eat. Or for those of us who've been told that what the church has to offer isn't for them, we can be receivers of this food from God's own hand, unmediated by sources that would mess it up, free of effort on our part. Jesus simply offers us the stuff of life freely from his own hand. So Jesus is body positive, and we are receivers of God's grace. And third is the invitation to consume Christ, not others. We live in a consumer culture where our appetites can almost always be filled just by spending a little money. Think of all the things you consume. You consume food, gasoline, firewood, heating oil, electricity, and so much more. Unfortunately, one of the downsides of this consumer culture is that we also have found ourselves in the place of knowingly or unknowingly consuming the bodies and the lives of others that we've decided are less than. I'm talking about bullying, about human trafficking, about employment practices that don't respect the full humanity of workers so that we can have cheap products. I'm talking about unsustainable fishing and foresting, and especially the way that so much of the wealth and prosperity of our nation was built by the bodies of people who were enslaved in all kinds of industries. Bodies that white people consumed in order for their own benefit. And the descendants of those people still don't benefit from the prosperity that their ancestors built. There's so many huge and small ways that we consume other people for our own benefit. We're willing to take up the energy, the resources, the gifts, the naivete, the position of other people so that we can get ahead in some way, sometimes we're aware of it and sometimes we're not. But Jesus set out to put an end to our consuming of one another by offering himself for our consumption. Because when we consume the body and blood of Christ, we receive that fully alive life that God created us for, and we don't have the need to consume another human being or another creation of God for our own benefit. When we consume Christ, we have literal union with God. Jesus uses the language of abiding. When you consume me, I abide in you and you abide in me. And when we have that literal union of God with God, what more could we possibly need? Consume Christ, not others. So the Jews respond to this by saying, this is a difficult teaching. Who can accept it? Do you feel that? And a bunch of the crowd decided after this to stop following Jesus because this teaching is weird. And it threatens the status quo, even for people who are in the ill-fitting hand-me-down jeans crowd. I mean, Jesus pretty much said that he's better than this revered manna that they received in the wilderness. He says he's better than that. If they're going to continue following Jesus, they're going to have to grapple with the past of their religion and the way that Jesus makes it new. And consuming Christ is not a neatly packaged set of spiritual practices. It's hard to preach about this stuff because it's weird. This requires that we sit in the messiness of our bodies because that's exactly what Jesus does. and accept Christ's unconditional honoring of our bodies. Sometimes I think we'd rather starve than be fed in places that are uncomfortable. Sometimes it's easier to sit in the discomfort that you know rather than to move into comfort and security and well-being that you don't know. This teaching is difficult. Who can accept it? And our ability to treat other human beings or the earth as disposable suddenly goes away. This requires everything of us if we eat Christ. This is difficult. Who can accept it, they say. Yet for those who want to accept it, there's this promise of a fully alive life in God's never-ending presence. God stands, food in hand, ready for us to come and eat. Will you join me in prayer? God, thank you for the way that you stuck with this crowd in Galilee way back when they pursued you, when they didn't understand the signs that you were giving, even when they didn't accept your teaching. Thank you for sticking with them, because we are the same. We pursue you, and yet we don't understand what you have to offer us, and sometimes we turn away. And yet, God, you stand there with your hands open, your arms open, offering us your very flesh and blood for us to consume. This nourishment that will give us full life that you long for us. God, when this is difficult, help us to be honest about that. And when we are ready to accept it, we thank you for the places and the people that we can share it with. In your name we pray. Amen.